To say that Blizzard has been a massive influence in my life is most definitely an understatement. As I was finishing high school, much like everyone else, I had multiple choices in front of me when it came to what career path I was going to choose. This is one of those choices that torments every teenager as you get closer and closer to the day where you eventually have to make a decision. I remember feeling the weight of that decision to this very day, and regardless of whatever rationalization my young teenage brain came up with to justify my choice of specializing my future education around computer science, the undeniable truth is that my dream was to one day work for Blizzard as a programmer. Now, I wasn't naive to the point where I believed this would actually happen, mind you. I was simply following a foolish dream, pursuing a what-if scenario. I knew in my heart that it would never really take place, but I still allowed myself to have hope. I mean, you never know, right? I was a fracking idiot. Anyway, whereas most gamers got started with their Blizzard relationship through the Warcraft IP, whether that was one of the RTS games or World of Warcraft, the game that initially got its hooks in me was actually Starcraft, because of the sheer quality of the experience and the powerful map editing tools that allowed me to live the dream as I created my own campaigns and shared them with friends. The original Terran theme still gives me heavy nostalgia vibes. The best heavy nostalgia vibes. God, I love playing that game. As time moved on, I eventually got hooked on Diablo 2, which to this day is still my favorite Blizzard game and maybe even my third favorite game of all time. Diablo 2 was actually the game that got me hooked on min-maxing builds. I created so many characters that I needed like 5 different Battle.net accounts, some of which only contained mules in order to hold my items. You need to understand that at one point I had the hardest hitting barbarian weapon in all of Europe. It did have the annoying stat, hit causes monster to flee, but I fixed that with Ice Blink. So if in your Diablo 2 days you ever saw the duped version of that particular executioner's sword, know that the original came from me. Ah, the good old days. Naturally, the progression of most Blizzard fans eventually takes them to World of Warcraft, and I was no exception. In fact, this was the first subscription-based MMO I ever played. I wasn't able to play it right at the start, you see, because here's what happened when I went up to my parents and said, "Hey, can I have some money every month to play this video game?" So yeah, I was only able to actually pay for a subscription when I got my first paying job, and that was shortly before Burning Crusade came out. So basically, for a couple of years, this was the only game I played. And in my opinion, this is the game where Blizzard lost their soul. The necessity to constantly develop content for a live service game was something that Blizzard hadn't really dealt with. Up until that point, they'd work on a game, put out an expansion, and move on to the next project. But no one was ready for the earth-shattering success of World of Warcraft. This was no longer a game they could just release an expansion before moving on to the next project. This was Blizzard's biggest success, and nothing would ever be the same. As I played and experienced the content World of Warcraft had to offer, I was always happy to continue to pay for the monthly fee, because unlike other MMOs you could play for free at the time, paying for WoW's subscription fee meant I had access to all of the game's content without any paywalls. So long as I had the skill to run the content, I could get anything that was available in the game. This changed at some point in 2010. I believe it was around March when Blizzard introduced the Celestial Steed to their store. This was the first time I ever actually felt bad about paying the subscription fee, because I no longer had access to all of the game's content. If I wanted to get this mount, I needed to pay more money on top of the subscription fee, and that simply never sat right with me. And you want to know the worst part about this disgusting cash grab move? My girlfriend loved the way that mount looked. And if you were paying attention at the start of this video, there's a sentence that's incredibly relevant for this next bit. I was a fracking idiot. So yeah, I bought it for her. I felt incredibly dirty for supporting that disgusting cash grab, but hey, I got needs. Happy girlfriend meant more sexy time. Anyhow, I realized that everyone has their own moment when they began losing faith in Blizzard. And that one was mine. That was the beginning of the downward slope, and that was also my favorite World of Warcraft expansion. Wrath of the Lich King, fantastic questing experience, great themes and dungeons, and the best raid ever made. Which was quickly followed by the worst raid ever made. But I digress. Being a huge Diablo fan, I was naturally looking forward to Diablo 3 when it eventually came along. That ended up being another huge disappointment, as Blizzard announced they would be implementing a real money auction house, which interestingly enough was actually defended by some of Blizzard's sycophant fans. Naturally, I was always against the real money auction house, even if at the time I wasn't even fully aware of just how much it would taint the experience. Because you see, in order to make the auction house relevant, Blizzard tweaked the drop rates of rare and legendary items to be a lot lower than they should have been, which essentially funneled most players into the auction house to acquire the items they needed in order to progress through the game. It is important to mention that there were actually 2 auction houses, and one of them used in-game currency. It didn't make the gameplay experience any better, as essentially your gameplay loop now consisted of farming gold to spend on the auction house in order to get the gear you needed to continue playing. This was the only Diablo game I never really ventured into the higher difficulties because the gameplay loop was unsatisfying. I was essentially playing a loot-based RPG that had no loot. I burned out faster than I could have ever imagined. They did eventually fix Diablo 3 with the introduction of Loot 2.0, and that caused me to go back and really enjoy the game. Who would have known that removing a feature that should have never existed in any game developed ever, and increasing the drop rates in a loot game back to an acceptable level would actually get the player base to come back and enjoy the game. The story of Diablo 3 was still trash though. Yeah, there was no fixing that, but hey, at least the game was enjoyable now. The console version of Diablo 3 was actually the last traditional video game Blizzard ever developed. And this statement might confuse some of you. Why wouldn't I consider the PC version of Diablo 3 a traditional video game? Because you see, after Blizzard developed World of Warcraft, they realized there was a very real social component to their MMO. This was, and still might be, I don't really keep up with the numbers these days, the biggest MMO ever made. Friendships were forged in this game, very real relationships were built, and potentially one of the largest gaming communities of its time was established. Naturally, Blizzard wanted to leverage that community to increase potential sales of future titles. This is only natural. What isn't natural is doing so at the expense of the user experience. But that's exactly what they did when they launched Starcraft 2. The sequel to the game that got me hooked on Blizzard actually released before Diablo 3, but the reason I'm bringing it up now is because it perfectly exemplifies Blizzard's vision for their future games. They wanted a connected community, a community that was always online, chatting amongst themselves across different Blizzard titles. To this end, Blizzard essentially killed offline single player in Starcraft 2. I mean, you could play it offline, but you couldn't save. So either play through the entirety of the Starcraft 2 campaign in one sitting, or log into the Battle.net servers in order to be able to play it like a regular game. The advantage of keeping your community constantly connected across multiple games is that they essentially do your marketing for you. Gamers always want their friends to play the same games they are playing, especially when there's multiplayer involved. So StarCraft 2 players would convince their friends that were playing World of Warcraft to buy StarCraft 2, and in turn, the World of Warcraft players would convince StarCraft players to renew their World of Warcraft subscription. Now bear in mind, I don't think this strategy is entirely malicious. I mean, I'm always connected to my friends, we play games together, Blizzard makes more money, seems like a win-win situation. I would even say this was a valuable addition to the game if it was optional. The malicious part of this strategy was when Blizzard decided that players needed to be online even to play the single-player campaign. And hey, if your ISP craps out on you, or if our servers are undergoing maintenance, too bad, you can't play any of our games. The PC version of Diablo 3 was also always online, and I'm sure someone out there watching this video right now remembers good old Error 37 during your first week of Diablo 3.
Error 37! Error 37! I keep trying to log in and I get error 37!
The consequences of always online games were definitely felt that day, as millions of players tried playing the video game they bought with their hard-earned money only to be greeted by an error message and a whole lot of frustration. And this is why I said the console version of Diablo 3 is the last traditional Blizzard game ever published, because it was the only version that could be played offline and where the social features were entirely optional. Since then, Blizzard has published Hearthstone, Heroes of the Storm, and Overwatch. And as a fan of their games, I naturally played my fair share of these titles, particularly Heroes of the Storm and Overwatch during the TGN Squadron days. Although most of my enjoyment in these games came from the fact that I was playing with friends, and not necessarily the games themselves. But what these games have in common is a distinct and easily identifiable monetization strategy. You see, Blizzard was no longer in the business of producing video games for a passionate audience. It was now in the business of producing software that enabled them to monetize the passion of their community in any way they could. In Hearthstone, they sell you card packs. In Heroes of the Storm, they sell you heroes and cosmetics. And in Overwatch, they sell you loot boxes. Actually, wait, I think in Heroes, they also sell you loot boxes now. I can't really keep up with all their monetization tactics nowadays, as you can imagine. Now, last year, in 2018, the nostalgia hit me really hard, and I caved and resubbed to World of Warcraft because the new expansion looked like it was going to be really interesting. I leveled up 2 characters, did a few raids with some of my old guildmates, and ran a ton of Mythic Plus dungeons. You see, 5-man dungeons have always been my favorite part of World of Warcraft. Now, since I hadn't really played for a couple of years, I was actually very surprised to see how the loot worked in current-day Mythic Plus dungeons. Basically, the drop rates for anything were reduced drastically, and instead of getting your loot in the dungeons themselves, your reward would come during the weekly reset, and its quality would vary depending on the hardest dungeon you had successfully completed during the previous week. So in essence, you are actually discouraged from running Mythic Plus content more than once per week, because quite simply you weren't going to get properly rewarded for your efforts. I was incredibly disappointed and naturally burned out, because essentially my favorite thing to do in the game had been streamlined for the sole purpose of artificially prolonging the time it would take players to gear up their characters. Oh, also, I forgot to mention, that reward was one random item from a pool of over 300, and it didn't take into account your current equipment. So basically, you could be running Mythic Plus dungeons for months without actually getting anything useful. And this is without even bringing up Titan Forging. As you can expect, I burned out after a couple of weeks of doing this and getting absolutely no upgrades. I mean, if my Monster Hunter World Iceborne luck is anything to go by, you already know the only thing waiting for me at the end of every weekly reset was disappointment. And disappointment is what we had to look forward to during BlizzCon 2018. Blizzard started hyping up their Diablo community ahead of the event, giving hints that there would be major announcements, only to suddenly stop the hype train in its tracks, telling people to rein in their expectations a couple of days before the con. It was really weird. And then during the opening ceremony, we all know what happened that year. It spawned the 5-part video series in my channel where I vented my frustrations and talked about how we got to a point where Blizzard outsourced the mobile port of Diablo 3 to a Chinese company and called it Diablo Immortal. I'm not going to go into too much detail around the Diablo Immortal situation since I've already done 5 videos on that topic, so if you're really curious about that, you can go check those out. Now, ahead of the Diablo Immortal announcement, the CEO of Blizzard, Mike Morhaime, publicly announced he was leaving the company. In my opinion, because he got tired of fighting his corporate overlords and chose to cut ties rather than see his company continue down the path of producing monetization software over actual games. Shortly after this debacle that we all know as a Diablo Immortal reveal, and free from the moral compass of Mike Morhaime, Blizzard decided the Heroes of the Storm esports scene wasn't generating enough revenue for them, so they abruptly announced in a blog post that they were done with the whole thing. As for the people who built a career around the Heroes of the Storm professional scene, too bad. But if you think that decision was reprehensible, don't worry, because earlier this year in 2019, I believe it was around February, after experiencing record financial performance, they laid off about 800 people. Because apparently it wasn't enough to make a lot of money, they needed to make all the money. And this brings us to present day, where Blizzard suspends a professional Hearthstone player for showing support to the people fighting for basic human rights in Hong Kong. Not only they suspended this player, but they also suspended the casters of the event, all to please the Chinese government and ensure their dealings in China remain unaffected. Their apologies and justification for these acts during BlizzCon 2019 rang hollow, with no actions to actually back up their words. Announcing Diablo 4 was the safest thing they could have done after the Diablo Immortal debacle, which wasn't even mentioned in this year's opening ceremony. They also announced the new World of Warcraft expansion that starts off in Icecrown, appealing to the nostalgia of what is considered one of the most beloved World of Warcraft expansions, and Overwatch 2. Which, to be fair, I don't even understand why it needs to exist. I thought the whole point of having a live service game like Overwatch was that you were able to update it like World of Warcraft. I guess they can probably get more money in PR chatter if they announce a sequel. I don't know. Calculated. That is the word that comes to mind when I look at this year's BlizzCon. From Brack's apology to the reveal of Diablo 4 and everything that followed. Blizzard no longer has passion. One might argue they haven't had passion for a few years now. But like I said at the start of this video, I was a fracking idiot. And nostalgia is one fickle, heartless female dog. So in the end, I still want Blizzard to go through a return to form. As unrealistic and downright stupid as it may be, I still think that would be the best result for everyone involved. Or do you think that Blizzard going through multiple rounds of layoffs and Blizzard IP eventually ending up in limbo would be a preferable outcome? There's real money to be made in real video games, and I just wish publishers would understand that and stop trying to sell us monetization software. But then again, I'm just an old man talking into a microphone. What the hell do I know? Thank you very much for watching. If you enjoyed this video, please take the time to leave a like. If you didn't enjoy the video, then leave a dislike. Subscribe if you want more videos from me, and I'll see you in the next one.